Before we begin, a quick and genuine thank you to Dakota. This episode exists because of you. If you're listening to this on Spotify right now, please take 10 seconds and leave a review. It costs nothing, it takes almost no time, and it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need a story to fall asleep to. Alright, let's go somewhere very few people have ever looked. The document that was never supposed to exist. There is a filing cabinet somewhere in the United States Federal Records System. Or perhaps it is a server now. A cold, humming digital archive behind a clearance level most people will never be named on. Inside that archive, or that cabinet, or whatever container holds the things a government decides are too sensitive for public consumption, there is a category of documents from a case that was considered closed in 1979. The case had a name, Operation Snow White, and the official story, the one printed in court transcripts, summarised in news articles, and referenced in intelligence histories, is clean, tidy, contained. A religious organisation overstepped, agents were placed inside federal offices, documents were stolen, people were convicted, and the matter was resolved. That is the version they wanted you to remember. But there is another version. Not a theory built from nothing. Not speculation assembled from thin air. A version built from discrepancies. Small ones. The kind that only appear when you read the inventory logs carefully. When you compare what was described in court to what was listed during the raid. When you ask a retired archivist a question that makes them pause a little too long before answering. The full archive of seized materials has never been completely released. Thousands of documents were catalogued. Some were used in court, others quietly, disappeared into classified storage. This is a story about one of the largest domestic intelligence seizures in American history. It is a story about infiltration, paranoia, and the architecture of government secrecy. But it is also a story about something that may have been found during that infiltration, something that neither side in the conflict intended to expose, something that required, once discovered, a very careful kind of burial. Settle in. This one takes a while to unravel, and the further in you go, the harder it becomes to look away. Act 1. The Real Operation. 1973. The Architecture of Infiltration. To understand what Operation Snow White became, you have to understand what it was at the beginning, which means you have to understand the organisation that built it. The Church of Scientology, founded by L. Ron Hubbard in the early 1950s, had by the late 1960s developed a complicated and increasingly adversarial relationship with the United States government, auditing records, tax disputes, investigations by the Food and Drug Administration, congressional inquiries. The relationship between Scientology and federal oversight bodies was not merely tense. It was, from Hubbard's perspective, an active war. Hubbard's response to perceived enemies was not passive. It was organisational, systematic. He had built a faith, but he had also built something that operated more like an intelligence agency than a church. That organisational arm, the one responsible for handling opposition, was called the Guardian's Office. And by 1973, the Guardian's Office had a plan. The plan was called Operation Snow White. The goal, as it was later reconstructed in federal court, was specific. Identify every negative government document that referenced Scientology, locate where those documents were held, and remove or alter them. In practice, this meant placing operatives, trained, disciplined, methodical operatives, inside the very agencies that had been investigating the church, not outside them, inside. The woman placed at the centre of this effort was Mary Sue Hubbard, L. Ron Hubbard's wife, and the head of the Guardian's Office. She was not a peripheral figure, she was the operational architect. The structure she built was not improvised, it was modelled in some respects on intelligence tradecraft. Agents used cover identities. They obtained jobs inside federal offices through falsified credentials. They photographed documents and passed them through networks of couriers. Over the next several years, agents working under the Snow White umbrella were placed inside the Internal Revenue Service, the Department of Justice, U.S. Attorney's offices, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Treasury Department, and the Coast Guard. They were not visitors. They were employees, Some held their positions for months, others for longer, and every day they worked. They copied documents. Restricted. Project Hunter. June 1976. The expansion. No one talked about. By the middle of the decade, Operation Snow White had grown beyond its original architecture. Internal Guardian's Office communications, many of which would later be seized and reviewed, show that the operation had been divided into sub-programs. Each sub-program had a designation. Each designation had a stated objective. And most of those objectives, when they eventually came to light, aligned with what the Church had always claimed. They were protecting themselves. But one sub-program was different. It was called Project Hunter. In the documentation that eventually became public, Project Hunter was described as a program targeting critics of Scientology, journalists, former members, academics who had written skeptically about the organization's practices. This framing made it legible. It fit the narrative that would later be presented in court, and so it was accepted. But fragments of internal communication, not all of which made it into the public record, suggested something more complicated. Certain documents recovered during the 1977 raids were tagged with language that did not align with the Church's stated objectives. These documents were marked with phrases indicating priority retrieval, and the classification language attached to them had nothing to do with Scientology. Guardian's Office. Internal memo fragment / partial recovery priority retrieval. Restricted classification source. Origin Agency. Handling, non-church, separate archive authorization. The question that Fragment raises is not a comfortable one. If Guardian's Office operatives were inside federal agencies copying documents related to Scientology, which they were, what stopped them from copying other things? What prevented an agent sitting at a desk inside a federal office for 8 hours a day from noticing that the filing cabinet in the corner contained something entirely unrelated to their mission? Something interesting, something sensitive, something that, once seen, could not be unseen. The question that Fragment raises is not a comfortable one. If Guardian's Office operatives were inside federal agencies copying documents related to Scientology, which they were, what stopped them from copying other things? What prevented an agent sitting at a desk inside a federal office for 8 hours a day from noticing that the filing cabinet in the corner contained something entirely unrelated to their mission? Something interesting, something sensitive, something that, once seen, could not be unseen. The answer, of course, is nothing. Nothing stopped them, and it is worth pausing here to appreciate the texture of what daily life inside a federal office looked like during this period, because the popular image of government document security in the 1970s bears almost no resemblance to the reality. There were no badge readers, there were no electronic access logs, there were no cameras in the hallways recording who went where. Documents moved between offices in manila folders carried by staff members whose access was governed largely by their job title and the trust of their supervisors. Filing cabinets were locked at the end of the day, sometimes, and unlocked each morning by whoever arrived first. An operative placed inside this environment, trained to observe and copy, motivated by institutional loyalty and accustomed to methodical work, would not have needed to conduct elaborate searches to encounter sensitive material. They would simply have needed to be there, to be present, to keep their eyes open while their hands did the work they had been assigned. And that is where the story becomes something other than the story we were told. Act 2. The Raid. July 8, 1977. 156 agents. The morning of July 8, 1977 began like most summer mornings in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. Warm, bright, ordinary. But by mid-morning, the ordinary had been replaced by something that would later be described, in the understated language of federal reports, as a coordinated domestic intelligence operation of significant scale. 156 FBI agents moved simultaneously, 2 cities, 2 sets of Scientology offices, 2 coordinated raids conducted with the kind of precision that suggested they had been planned for a very long time. In Los Angeles, agents entered the Cedars complex, a sprawling former hospital that the church had purchased and converted into its western headquarters. In Washington, D.C., agents moved on the church's national offices. Both operations unfolded within the same window of time. Both were executed with search warrants that had been months in preparation. What they found was extraordinary. Over 48,000 documents were seized. Internal communications, operation plans, personnel files, training materials, lists of targets, lists of agents, lists of lists. The volume was not accidental. The Guardian's office had been meticulous, and its meticulousness had produced an archive of its own crimes. File by file, the structure of Operation Snow White emerged from the boxes that were carried out of those buildings and into federal custody. The FBI had been building toward this moment for years. A former Scientology insider named Michael Meissner had turned cooperating witness after his own involvement in the operation had brought him to the edge of federal charges. His testimony, combined with physical surveillance of Guardian's office activities, had given investigators enough to construct the warrants. And once those warrants were executed, the architecture of the entire infiltration campaign became visible. The raids were, by almost any measure, a triumph of domestic law enforcement. They dismantled the operational infrastructure of one of the most ambitious civilian intelligence operations ever conducted against the United States government. They produced evidence sufficient to convict 11 senior Scientology officials, including Mary Sue Hubbard herself. And they closed, publicly, a chapter that had been written in secret for more than 4 years. That is what happened on July 8th, 1977. That is the version of events that entered the historical record. But the historical record, as any archivist will tell you, is never quite complete. Consider the logistics of what it means to seize 48,000 documents in a single day. Each document must be physically handled, removed from its location, placed in a container, labelled with some indication of where it came from, transported and eventually delivered to a processing facility, where trained personnel will begin the work of reviewing, cataloguing, and assessing its relevance to the investigation. That process, for a collection of this size, takes weeks, sometimes months. And during those weeks and months, a great many decisions are made about how to categorize what has been found. Decisions that are not made in courtrooms, are not subject to adversarial review, and are not part of any public record. The people who make those decisions are professionals. They are experienced in handling sensitive materials. They understand the classification system. They know, when they open a box and begin reviewing its contents, how to identify something that requires special handling, and they know the protocols for routing that something to the appropriate authority without creating a paper trail that will later appear in a court filing. This is not a criticism, it is a description. It is how a large, experienced federal agency processes a complex and sensitive document collection. The system is designed to function this way. The question is not whether the system works. It clearly does. The question is what it produces when it works correctly on a collection like the Snow White Archive. The public trial and the shape of the narrative. The prosecutions that followed the 1977 raids unfolded over 2 years. By 1979, the key figures in Operation Snow White had been convicted. Mary Sue Hubbard received a 5-year sentence. 9 other Guardian's office operatives received sentences ranging from probation to 5 years. The charges were clear: obstruction of justice, theft of government property, burglarizing government offices, and intercepting government communications. The trial gave the public a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. A religious organization motivated by institutional paranoia and an overwhelming desire to protect itself from scrutiny had built a spy network and inserted it into the machinery of the federal government. The network had been discovered. The perpetrators had been punished. The matter was resolved. The media covered it extensively. Congressional observers noted it. Intelligence historians referenced it. And then, as cases do, it receded. It became a footnote. A remarkable, bizarre, unprecedented footnote, but a footnote nonetheless. Scientology's internal infiltration campaign was absorbed into the broader cultural understanding of the organisation as litigious, secretive, and willing to cross legal lines in its own defence. Case closed, except for the inventory logs. Act 3. The Missing Files. Present day, the discrepancy in the archive. His name, for the purposes of this account, is Aaron Vance. He's not the kind of man who seeks attention. He's the kind of man who reads federal inventory logs at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night because something in the footnote of a Cold War intelligence history did not quite add up. Vance had been working for several years on a broader project, an investigation into the documented history of domestic surveillance abuses in the United States from the 1960s through the 1980s. His research had taken him through the Church Committee hearings, through the COINTELPRO files, through the records of Operation Chaos and the Army intelligence activities that had monitored anti-war protesters. He was not new to the architecture of government secrecy. He understood how these systems worked, and more importantly, he understood how they documented themselves. That understanding was what led him to the Snow White files. He had requested access to a portion of the declassified records from the 1977 raids. Not all of them, just a specific subset related to the document categories that had been described in court, filings. He wanted to cross-reference them against intelligence program timelines he was building for a separate chapter of his research. It was, he later described, a routine archival task. But the inventory logs he received were not what he expected. Across several pages of the cataloguing documentation, the systematic record of what had been seized during the raids and how each item had been handled, he found a category designation that appeared multiple times, attached to documents that had no further description. The designation read, "Removed prior to cataloguing. No description of content. No identification of the originating office. No indication of where the materials had been transferred." Just that phrase, repeated, across a number of line items that represented an unknown quantity of documents from an unknown source. Vance stared at that phrase for a long time. In federal archival practice, the phrase "removed prior to cataloguing" is not standard. Materials seized during a raid are catalogued at the point of collection. That is the procedure. That is how the chain of custody is maintained. Removing documents before they enter the cataloguing process, before they receive an identification number and a description, is an exception so unusual that it requires either an emergency justification or a level of authorization that comes from somewhere far above the field agents conducting the collection. Someone had pulled those documents out of the process before the process could describe them, and whoever had done it had left only that phrase behind as evidence it had happened at all. The archivist. It took Vance several months to locate the person he needed to speak with. The retired federal archivist, a woman who had worked in document processing and records management for the Department of Justice for over 2 decades, had not spoken publicly about her career since her retirement. She was not, by her own description, someone who believed in conspiracy theories. She was someone who believed in procedures. That was precisely why her account was valuable. She told Vance, in a conversation he recorded with her permission, that she had been part of the team responsible for processing a portion of the Snow White document collection in the months following the 1977 raids. Her role had been administrative, receiving boxes, cross-referencing inventory numbers, ensuring the cataloguing workflow was being followed correctly. At a certain point during that process, she had noticed something. A subset of materials, she could not say exactly how large, but she characterized it as meaningful rather than trivial, had been separated from the main collection. This separation had not been handled through the standard DOJ document processing chain. The materials had been removed by personnel she did not recognize. Using authorization, she was not given access to review. She had asked a supervisor about it and been told, in terms she described as professionally final, that the matter was outside her scope. The materials were transferred to another agency, she believed. Not the FBI, not the DOJ. She did not know which agency. She had never seen those documents again, and no public record she was aware of acknowledged their existence. "I thought about it for a long time," she told Vance. "Not because I thought something terrible had happened, but because it was irregular. And in that job, irregular was something you noticed. Irregular. A quiet word for a quiet alarm that had been ringing, unheard, for decades. Act 4. The second objective. What the infiltrators actually found here is the question that Vance could not stop returning to. The one that kept him at his desk past midnight. The one that reorganised everything else he thought he understood about Operation Snow White. If Guardian's office operatives spent years embedded inside federal agencies, not observing from a distance but working, daily, in physical proximity to internal records, what else did they see? The 1970s were not a politically quiet decade for American intelligence. The years between 1973 and 1977, precisely the years of Operation Snow White's active phase, were years of extraordinary turbulence inside the intelligence community. The Church Committee, formerly the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, was conducting the most comprehensive investigation of American intelligence abuses ever undertaken. Revelations were emerging about COINTELPRO, about assassination plots against foreign leaders, about domestic surveillance programs that had operated for years without congressional oversight. The agencies that Scientology's operatives had infiltrated were not sleepy bureaucratic offices. They were agencies in the middle of managing their own internal crises. They were producing documents about their own activities, documents about programs that were in some cases still classified, still active, still sensitive in ways that the agency's own leadership was only beginning to acknowledge. And in the middle of all of that, there were Scientology agents, sitting at desks, opening filing cabinets, copying whatever they were told to copy, and perhaps noticing things they had not been told to look for. Internal Guardian's office language, recovered in the 1977 raids and partially available in court records, includes a phrase that Vance flagged in his research. The phrase describes a category of acquired material in terms that do not align with the Church's stated objectives. The language reads, acquisition of external intelligence files unrelated to Church interests. Unrelated to Church interests. That is not standard language in an operation designed to protect a church. That is the language of an operation that found something it was not looking for, and decided to keep it anyway. The programs behind the programs. To understand what Snow White operatives might have encountered, you have to understand the landscape of classified activity that was present inside federal offices during those years, and that landscape, even in its publicly acknowledged form, is extraordinary. The Internal Revenue Service, one of the primary targets of Snow White infiltration, had been involved in a program called the Special Services Staff, a unit that had been established in the late 1960s to monitor and investigate organisations deemed politically subversive. The SSS had maintained files on thousands of individuals and organisations, many of which had no tax-related violations whatsoever. The programme had been quietly discontinued in the early 1970s, following internal and congressional pressure, but its files had not been destroyed. The Department of Justice, another Snow White target, had been the administrative home for oversight of programs that range from witness protection to organised crime intelligence to counterintelligence coordination. Its internal records during the relevant period would have contained references to ongoing investigations, surveillance programs, and inter-agency information sharing arrangements that were not reflected in any public record. And then there were the programs that were not housed in any of these offices but whose administrative traces, requests, authorizations, coordination memos would have passed through them. Programs with names that had not yet been disclosed. Programs whose existence was, at the time, known only to a small number of cleared individuals at each participating agency. A Guardian's office operative, working diligently through a filing cabinet in a federal office, copying documents related to Scientology, could very easily have encountered a document that had nothing to do with Scientology, a routing slip, a memo header, a reference number attached to a program designation that meant nothing to the operative, but would mean a great deal to someone else. That is not speculation. That is geometry. The spaces overlapped, the documents shared physical proximity, and the operatives were thorough. Act 5. The Conspiracy Theory. What the raid actually recovered. Vance's hypothesis, assembled over months of archival research and conversations with former federal employees, is careful. He's not a man who reaches conclusions his evidence cannot support. What he proposes is not that Operation Snow White was secretly a government intelligence operation, or that the church was being used as a proxy for some deeper agenda. What he proposes is simpler, and in some ways more disturbing. He proposes that the 1977 FBI raids recovered two things. The first was what everyone already knows, an enormous archive of the Guardian's office's own operational records, documenting the infiltration of federal agencies, the identities of agents, the methods used, and the documents stolen. This archive became the foundation of the criminal prosecution. It was the story that was told in court and in the press. The second was something else entirely, a collection of materials that Guardian's office operatives had accumulated during their years inside federal offices, materials that were not related to Scientology, not related to the church's interests, and not meant to be in civilian hands at all. Materials that, in the process of being thorough, Snow White agents had copied alongside the documents they were actually looking for. Materials that, once identified during the post-raid document review, created a problem that had nothing to do with prosecuting a church. The problem was this. Those materials documented things that were still classified, things that, if they became part of a public court record, would require acknowledgement of programs whose existence the relevant agencies were not prepared to confirm, and so, quietly, professionally, with the kind of administrative efficiency that large institutions deploy when managing sensitive problems, those materials were removed, not destroyed necessarily, transferred, separated from the cataloguing process before they could receive identification numbers, moved to a location that does not appear in any public record, and the public narrative of Operation Snow White was allowed to proceed without them, clean, tidy, contained. The Byrne notice that wasn't in the secondary literature surrounding Operation Snow White, the books, the investigative articles, the oral histories collected from former church members and federal investigators, there is a reference that appears occasionally and is rarely examined closely. It is a reference to an internal federal memo, the origin and authorship of which have never been publicly confirmed, that was cited in at least one secondary source by a researcher working in the 1980s. The memo, as described in that secondary source, contained a directive related to the handling of materials recovered during the Snow White raids. The relevant passage, as characterised by the researcher who referenced it, included the phrase, "non-church materials to be secured and restricted indefinitely." Non-church materials. A phrase that acknowledges, explicitly, that there were materials in the Snow White collection that did not belong to the church's operational files, materials that required a separate handling designation, materials that were not going to become part of the public record. The researcher who cited this memo in the 1980s described it as a bureaucratic directive, routine, he suggested, for managing mixed document collections from large-scale raids. He did not treat it as remarkable. He moved on. Vance treats it as remarkable, because the phrase secured and restricted indefinitely is not bureaucratic language for routine document management. It is the language of permanent classification, the language used when materials are not being held pending future release, but when they are being held because they are never expected to be released at all. Act 6. The modern implication, the pattern that keeps repeating. Vance is not the first person to notice that American intelligence history has a recurring structural feature. Major investigations that expose specific abuses tend to also produce, as a byproduct, information about adjacent abuses, information that is managed carefully so that only the specific prosecutable abuse becomes public, while the adjacent material disappears into a more controlled process. The Church Committee's investigation of COINTELPRO, for example, documented systematic harassment and disruption of domestic political organisations. What it did not document, what its investigators later acknowledged they had been steered away from, were the full operational details of certain ongoing surveillance programs that had continued in modified form past the point when the public understood them to have ended. The investigations into the CIA's domestic activities in the same period, the ones that produced the family jewels documents, the internal CIA audit of its own illegal activities revealed extraordinary abuses, but the documents themselves, in their finely declassified form, have been noted by researchers to contain significant redactions and what appear to be structural gaps, places where the narrative of what was happening in a particular program during a particular period does not quite cohere, where the paper trail goes quiet at exactly the moments when something important should be documented. Vance's argument is that Operation Snow White fits into this pattern, not as a cause of these recurring gaps, but as a symptom of the system that produces them. A system in which the management of sensitive information is sophisticated enough that, when an unexpected breach occurs, even a breach caused by a criminal infiltration from outside the government, the response is calibrated, the breach is partially disclosed, the prosecution proceeds, the most sensitive elements are quietly extracted, and the public narrative is allowed to achieve closure without ever touching the parts that were never meant to be public in the first place. And there is something almost admirable, in a cold, institutional way, about the precision with which this process operates. It requires no single decision-maker, no villain at the centre issuing orders to suppress. It requires only that each person in the chain does their job correctly, routes things to the right authority, applies the appropriate designation, and does not ask questions about what comes next. The system produces silence not through active suppression, but through the accumulated effect of protocol followed faithfully at every level. That is a more sophisticated form of information management than any conspiracy requires. It does not leave fingerprints because it does not require intent. It requires only competence. Of the tightening. After Snow White. One of the less examined consequences of Operation Snow White, and Vance spends considerable time on this in his research, is what happened to federal document security protocols in the years immediately following the 1977 raids. Before Snow White, the physical security of documents inside federal agencies was, by later standards, relatively loose. Offices that contained sensitive records were not always physically separated from general administrative space. Visitors moved through areas where records were stored without systematic tracking. Employees had access, in some cases, to document categories well beyond the scope of their specific job functions. In the years following Snow White, this changed. Document management procedures inside federal agencies were overhauled, access protocols were tightened, physical security was upgraded, and, perhaps most significantly, the interagency frameworks for controlling information about sensitive programs were restructured in ways that made the kind of incidental access that Snow White operatives had achieved considerably more difficult. The official explanation for these reforms was straightforward. The Snow White infiltration had demonstrated a vulnerability, and the vulnerability had been addressed. That is a complete and defensible explanation. It requires nothing beyond itself to be true. But Vance notes that the scope of the reforms was broader than a simple response to the specific vulnerability that Snow White had exploited. The reforms addressed not just the physical access problem, the fact that operatives with false credentials had been able to enter federal offices and copy documents, but also the problem of what happened when classified information from one program was stored in physical proximity to documents accessible to employees at a lower clearance level. That second problem is not the Snow White problem. That is the problem of what Snow White found, and the fact that the reforms addressed both problems suggests that whoever designed those reforms understood that there were two problems to address. The Cold War context. The years of Operation Snow White's active phase, 1973 through 1977, were not simply years of domestic political turbulence. They were years in which the Cold War was entering a new and complicated phase, one characterized less by open confrontation and more by the management of information, influence, and perception. The intelligence programs operating during this period included efforts to monitor and counter Soviet influence inside domestic political organizations, programs that, if their existence had been exposed, would have been extraordinarily controversial given the political climate produced by the Church Committee revelations. The boundary between legitimate counterintelligence activity and the kind of domestic surveillance that had been publicly condemned was, in practice, a boundary that several programs were navigating very carefully. Documents related to these programs, routing memos, authorization chains, budget references, operational summaries, would have been present in the physical files of federal offices that Snow White operatives were accessing. An operative copying documents related to IRS treatment of Scientology would not have needed to go far to encounter a document that had nothing to do with tax law and everything to do with something much more sensitive. Whether those operatives understood what they had found is a separate question. Whether the Guardian's office, leadership understood the significance of the non-church materials in their collection is another. But the question Vance keeps returning to is the one that matters most for understanding what happened after the raids. Did the FBI and DOJ investigators who processed the Snow White collection understand what they had found? The answer implied by the inventory logs, by the archivist's account, and by the language of that secondary source memo is yes. They understood, and they acted accordingly. S7, the threads that connect, Snow White, and the architecture of secrecy. Vance spends the final section of his research connecting Operation Snow White to a broader argument about how American national security secrecy functions, not as a monolithic, centrally directed system, but as an emergent property of a large number of actors, each managing their own institutional interests. No single person decided that the Snow White documents would be managed the way they were. No secret committee convened to design a cover-up. What happened, Vance argues, was more prosaic, and in some ways more troubling. A large number of institutional actors, each following the incentive structure of their own position, each applying the protocols appropriate to their role, each making individually defensible decisions, collectively produced an outcome that left significant information permanently outside public view. The FBI agents who identified the non-church materials during the document review were not making a moral choice to conceal them. They were making a procedural choice to route sensitive materials to the appropriate classification authority. The classification authority that received those materials was not making a choice to obstruct justice. It was making a determination about what required protection. The administrators who redesigned document security protocols were not hiding anything. They were responding to an identified vulnerability. Each step was defensible. Each step followed a procedure, and the cumulative effect of all those individually defensible steps was that information recovered during a major domestic law enforcement operation, information that the public arguably had a right to know existed, became permanently inaccessible. That is the system. That is how it works. Not through conspiracy, but through procedure. Not through malice, but through institutional logic. Not through a decision to hide things, but through 1,000 small decisions that collectively amount to the same outcome. The whistleblowers who almost spoke. In the years following the Snow White prosecutions, several former federal employees who had been involved in the document review process made statements, in interviews, in correspondence with researchers, in one case in sworn testimony in an unrelated proceeding, that touched obliquely on the question of what the raids had actually recovered. None of these statements were explicit. None of them named specific programs or specific documents. None of them constituted a whistleblower disclosure in any formal sense. But taken together, they sketched the outline of something. A former Justice Department attorney who had worked peripherally on the Snow White prosecution told a journalist in the mid-1980s that the case had been, in his experience, unusual in the degree to which certain aspects of the document collection had been handled outside the normal chain of prosecutorial review. He described it as a case within a case, an outer structure that was fully visible and proceeded normally, and an inner structure that was managed separately by people he did not know and did not have access to. A former FBI analyst who had been assigned to the document processing team told a researcher in the 1990s that certain boxes from the Washington, D.C. raid had been removed from the processing facility within 48 hours of their arrival, before cataloguing, before review, before any member of his team had opened them. He had not been told why. He had not asked, because in his experience when things moved that quickly, asking was not what you did. And then there is the archivist, the woman Vance spoke with. The one who remembered the irregularity, the one who described the personnel she did not recognise removing materials through an authorisation she was not permitted to review. She ended her conversation with Vance with a sentence he quotes directly in his research, because he found it impossible to paraphrase adequately. She said, "Whatever was in those boxes, someone decided a very long time ago that the best thing for everyone was to not know it had ever been there." The digital age and the old files. The question of what happened to those missing documents did not end in 1979. It exists in a different form in the present, in the decades since the snow. White prosecutions, the broader landscape of federal records management has been transformed. The Freedom of Information Act has been strengthened and tested in thousands of cases. Mandatory declassification review processes have been implemented and revised. The National Declassification Centre has worked through enormous backlogs of Cold War-era documents, releasing material that was considered permanently classified a generation ago. Some Snow White-related materials have been released through FOIA requests over the years. Researchers and journalists and former Scientology members have obtained portions of the operational record, the trial documentation, the FBI investigation files. The publicly available record of Operation Snow White is, by Cold War intelligence standards, reasonably substantial. But the gaps persist. Certain FOIA requests related to Snow White materials have returned responses citing exemptions that are not typically applicable to law enforcement records from the relevant period. Exemptions that indicate ongoing classification concerns. Exemptions that point not to the protection of sources and methods in an active investigation. The case is closed, has been closed for decades, but to the protection of information that remains sensitive for reasons that are not explained in the response. Vance filed several of these requests. The responses he received were, in their own bureaucratic way, as interesting as any document he had reviewed, not because of what they disclosed, but because of the specific legal language used to justify what was not disclosed. The exemptions cited were not the exemptions of an agency protecting its ongoing work. They were the exemptions of an agency protecting something it had decided at some point should remain protected permanently. Whatever was in those boxes still has not come out. Act 8. The final question was, Operation Snow White, one story or two? Let us be precise about what is known and what is not, because precision is the only honest tool available in territory this uncertain. What is known? Operation Snow White was a real, documented, prosecuted criminal conspiracy in which the Church of Scientology placed operatives inside federal agencies and used those operatives to steal government documents. The 1977 raids recovered over 48,000 documents. 11 Scientology officials were convicted. The case is closed. What is also known? The inventory logs from those raids contain entries marked removed prior to cataloguing, with no further description of content or destination. A retired federal archivist with direct experience in the document processing operation described materials being separated from the main collection by unidentified personnel using unverifiable authorization. Secondary source literature from the 1980s references a federal memo directing non-church materials from the Snow White collection to be secured indefinitely. FOIA requests related to Snow White materials have returned exemptions consistent with ongoing classification concerns rather than routine law enforcement record management. What is not known? What those removed materials contained, which agency received them, whether they have been partially or fully declassified under a non-public process, whether they documented programs that are themselves now fully declassified, making their contents less sensitive than they were in 1977, or whether they documented programs that remain, even now, outside the public record. What Vance proposes, and what this documentary has followed him in proposing, is not that the official account of Operation Snow White is false. It is that the official account of Operation Snow White is incomplete, that the story told in court and in the press was the story of one operation, the Guardian's Office's infiltration of federal agencies in service of the Church of Scientology's institutional interests. But buried within the evidence recovered from that operation mixed in, perhaps accidentally, with the operational records of the Guardian's office itself, was the trace evidence of a second story. A story about what those operatives had encountered inside those federal offices. A story about the classified programs whose administrative shadows fell across the documents they were copying. A story that, once its outlines were recognised, was managed with the same careful efficiency that the broader intelligence system always applies to things it does not want to become public. That second story has never been told. Its documents have never been released. Its outlines are visible only in the gaps, in the inventory categories with no description, in the archivist's careful memory, in the exemptions on FOIA response letters that say, in their precise bureaucratic language, that something remains protected. Something that cannot be described. Something that was never supposed to be found in the first place. Epilogue. The files that didn't burn. There is something worth sitting with at the end of all of this. Operation Snow White is remembered, when it is remembered at all, as a curiosity. One of the stranger chapters in the long, strange history of American intelligence. A church that built a spy network. A spy network that infiltrated the government. A government that caught the spy network and prosecuted it. A story with clear villains, a clear resolution, and a clean moral. But the history of intelligence, the real history, the one that comes out piece by piece over decades as documents are declassified and officials reach the end of their careers and memories begin to feel more burdensome than they once did. The real history is never clean. It is layered. It is recursive. It contains stories inside stories, operations inside operations, files inside files. The Guardian's office, the operatives who sat at their desks inside federal agencies in the 1970s, were not especially sophisticated. They were not professional intelligence officers. They were true believers executing a plan designed by an organisation that was, in many respects, operating in a world it did not fully understand. They were copying documents related to their church, and sometimes, inevitably, in that environment during those years, they were copying things that had nothing to do with their church at all. They did not know what they had. They may not have cared, and in the end it did not matter, because the people who processed the materials after the raid did know, and they did care, and they acted on that knowledge with a precision and a quietness that has kept the inner story buried for nearly half a century. The outer story is in the history books. 11 convictions, 48,000 documents, Operation Snow White, the largest domestic intelligence breach ever, conducted by a non-governmental organisation against the United States government. The inner story is somewhere else, in a room that requires a clearance level most people will never be named on, in a filing system whose index has never been made public, in a category of materials that was, a very long time ago, designated as secured and restricted indefinitely. The files didn't burn. That much at least seems likely. Governments rarely destroy things they believe they might need someday. They just make sure you can't find them. And sometimes, rarely, in the gaps between the official record and the inventory logs, in the careful pauses of retired archivists, in the strange exemptions on response letters from agencies that have no obvious reason to still be protecting 40-year-old documents from a closed case, sometimes you can almost see the shape of what is being protected. Almost. Sleep well, Sleepy Koala Army, and the next time you read a story that feels finished, clean, tidy, resolved, remember that every archive has a back room, and not everything in the back room is meant for you. There is a final detail worth carrying with you as you close your eyes tonight. In the years after the Snow White prosecutions, L. Ron Hubbard himself went into deep seclusion. He had never been charged. The government's case focused on Mary Sue and the 11 other convicted operatives, and Hubbard maintained a legal distance from the Guardian's office activities that was always convenient and never quite credible. He lived his remaining years in isolation, moving between properties, rarely photographed, rarely seen. He died in 1986. Before his death, he revised and restructured the Church of Scientology's internal organisation in ways that effectively dismantled the Guardian's office, the very arm that had built and executed Operation Snow White. Its replacement, the Office of Special Affairs, assumed some of the same functions, but with a considerably more cautious operational profile. Whether this restructuring was a genuine response to the criminal convictions, or whether it was something more specific, a response to knowledge about what had been lost in the raid, what had been recovered, what was now in the hands of people Hubbard could no longer predict or control, is a question that has never been answered to anyone's satisfaction. What is certain is this: the organisation that built one of the most audacious domestic intelligence operations in American history dismantled the very structure responsible for it within a few years of the raids. And it did so quietly, without extensive public explanation, in a way that also happened to eliminate the institutional memory of exactly which documents had been collected, from which offices, and what some of those documents had contained. Convenient timing, or something more deliberate: the records that might tell us which do not appear to be in the public archive. They are almost certainly in the back room. Before we begin tonight's investigation, I want to ask for your support. If you find value in this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes an enormous difference in reaching new listeners, and if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. Finally, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive documentary content, please consider subscribing. It means everything. Tonight's story comes from a suggestion by Ms. Shi, and I knew immediately it needed to be told. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. The file sat in a banker's box in a government archive for nearly 40 years before anyone outside a classified circle ever saw it. When it was finally declassified, the language inside was clinical, procedural, almost boring. But buried in that bureaucratic prose was something far more disturbing than any sensational headline could convey. It was a record of bones, thousands of them, taken from the dead without permission, catalogued by age, location, and radioactive content. Most belonged to children. The project had a name that sounded almost cheerful, Project Sunshine, but there was nothing bright about what it revealed. This is not a story about monsters or conspiracies in the traditional sense. This is a story about what happens when scientific necessity collides with human dignity, about decisions made in silence, about data collected in the dark, and about a question that still echoes today. What is acceptable in the name of protecting the public, especially when the public never knows it's happening? Welcome to the story of Project Sunshine. Chapter 1. A world changed by the atom. The atomic age did not arrive quietly. It came with a flash of light over the deserts of New Mexico in the summer of 1945. It came with the obliteration of 2 cities in Japan. It came with promises of a future powered by the atom and threats of annihilation that could arrive in minutes. By the early 1950s, the world had entered a new kind of arms race. The United States and the Soviet Union were detonating nuclear weapons in the atmosphere with alarming regularity. Tests were conducted in Nevada, the Pacific, the Arctic, and Kazakhstan. Mushroom clouds rose over atolls and deserts. Shock waves rippled across continents. The public was told these tests were controlled, distant, safe. There is no danger to civilians, officials assured again and again. But behind closed doors, concern was mounting. Because while the explosions were visible and the shockwaves measurable, something else was spreading. Something invisible. Something that didn't respect borders or oceans or assurances. Fallout. Radioactive particles were drifting through the atmosphere, settling into soil, water and food supplies. They were entering the food chain, and from there they were entering human bodies. The first signs appeared in livestock. Ranchers in Nevada reported unusual deaths among cattle, grazing downwind from test sites. Veterinarians found lesions and burns that had no obvious cause. Milk samples from dairy farms began showing elevated radiation readings. Scientists began to ask uncomfortable questions. How much radiation were people actually absorbing? Was it accumulating over time? Were certain populations more vulnerable than others? And most troubling of all, were children at greater risk? These were not abstract questions. They were urgent, and they required data. Real data. Human data. The problem was that radiation exposure was difficult to measure in living subjects. External monitoring could detect surface contamination, but internal exposure, particularly the accumulation of radioactive isotopes in bones and organs, required invasive procedures or post-mortem examination. That need would give birth to one of the most ethically troubling research programs in modern history. The Atomic Energy Commission faced a dilemma. Public confidence in the nuclear testing program was essential. The arms race demanded continued development and testing of ever more powerful weapons. Any admission that fallout posed a genuine threat to civilian populations could undermine support for the entire enterprise. Yet the scientific uncertainty was real. Without reliable data about how radioactive materials move through the human body, policymakers were operating blind. They needed answers, but they needed those answers quietly. In conference rooms across Washington, scientists and government officials began discussing options. Animal studies were ongoing, but their applicability to humans remained questionable. Volunteer studies were proposed but deemed impractical. Who would willingly expose themselves to radiation for research purposes? And how? Could such a study be conducted without revealing the extent of public concern about fallout? The solution they arrived at was both ingenious and morally bankrupt. They would study the dead. Chapter 2. The Creation of Project Sunshine. In 1953, a group of scientists and government officials convened to address a growing problem. Atmospheric nuclear testing was continuing at an aggressive pace, but public anxiety was beginning to rise. Reports of contaminated milk, radioactive rain, and mysterious illnesses were starting to circulate. The Atomic Energy Commission needed answers. Not speculation, not theory. Facts. They needed to know exactly how much radioactive material was entering human bodies and where it was going once it got there. Project Sunshine was born from this urgency. Officially, it was described as a research initiative to study the distribution of radioactive isotopes in human tissue. The goal was to measure strontium-90, a byproduct of nuclear fission that mimicked calcium in the body. It accumulated in bones. It stayed there. And it was especially dangerous to growing children, whose bodies were rapidly building skeletal structure. If strontium-90 was embedding itself in bones, scientists needed to know how much, how fast, and in whom. The project was international in scope. Researchers coordinated with institutions in the United Kingdom, Australia, South Africa, and other allied nations. The language used in internal memos was careful, professional, detached. Initial planning documents outlined a comprehensive sampling strategy. Tissue would be collected from multiple age groups, but particular emphasis would be placed on infants and young children. Their rapidly developing bones would show the clearest evidence of strontium accumulation. Geographic diversity was essential to compare fallout levels across regions affected by different test sites and weather patterns. Funding was allocated through existing research, budgets carefully dispersed to avoid drawing attention. Laboratory facilities were identified at major research universities and government installations. Protocols were developed for sample collection, preservation, and analysis. But there was a problem. Animal studies could only tell them so much. Rats and monkeys did not metabolize strontium the same way humans did. The data they provided was useful, but incomplete. What they needed were human bones, fresh ones. And that is where the ethical foundation of Project Sunshine began to crack. The scientists involved were not villains in the traditional sense. They were researchers who genuinely believed in the importance of their work. Many had witnessed the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They understood the stakes of the nuclear age in visceral terms. They saw their research as a necessary step toward understanding and potentially mitigating the long-term consequences of atmospheric testing. But somewhere in the planning process, a crucial question was never adequately addressed. Did the importance of the research justify the methods required to conduct it? The answer they arrived at was yes, but they never asked the families. Chapter 3. The Unspoken Requirement. The decision was never announced publicly. There was no press release, no congressional hearing, no informed consent process. Instead, there was a quiet understanding among those involved. Human tissue samples would be collected. They would come from the recently deceased, and families would not be told. The reasoning, as later documents would reveal, was framed as practical. Asking permission would raise questions. Questions would lead to fear. Fear would lead to public panic. Panic would undermine the testing program and damage national security. Better, the thinking went, to proceed quietly. After all, the individuals were already dead. The tissue would otherwise be buried or cremated. Why not put it to scientific use? This logic, cold, utilitarian, and entirely one-sided, became the ethical cornerstone of the project. No one asked the families. No one explained what was happening. No one sought consent. The decision had been made at the highest levels. The work would proceed. Internal memos from the period reveal the careful linguistic gymnastics employed to avoid confronting the ethical implications directly. One document refers to obtaining samples through established pathological channels. Another describes the process as routine tissue acquisition for research purposes. The word consent appears nowhere in the early planning documents. There were dissenters. Some pathologists and medical examiners expressed reservations about participating in a program that operated without family knowledge. A few refused outright, but they were in the minority. Most were assured that the research was vital to national security and public health. Many were simply ordered to comply. The institutional machinery that enabled Project Sunshine was already in place. Hospitals and morgues routinely conducted autopsies. Tissue samples were frequently retained for medical education and research purposes. Extending these practices to include samples for radiation research required only minor procedural modifications, and so the infrastructure was established. Pathologists were contacted, protocols were distributed, sample collection began, and so it did. Chapter 4. The silent collection hospitals became collection sites. Morgues became supply chains. Medical examiners became unwitting participants in a global research network. The process was methodical. When a body arrived, particularly the body of an infant or young child, tissue samples were quietly extracted. Bone fragments in particular were prioritized. Femurs, ribs, vertebrae. These were sectioned, labelled, and shipped to laboratories for analysis. The families were never informed. Death certificates made no mention of tissue removal. Funeral directors received bodies that had been sampled, but they had no way of knowing. In some cases, entire limbs were removed and replaced with wooden dowels or broomsticks to maintain the appearance of an intact body for viewing. This practice, while shocking in retrospect, was not unprecedented. Similar substitutions had been used in anatomical procurement for medical schools for decades, but the context made it deeply disturbing. Parents grieving the loss of a child had no idea that the small body they held at a funeral was not entirely as they believed. The violation was invisible, complete, and irreversible. This was not illegal, strictly speaking. There were few regulations governing the use of cadaveric tissue in the early 1950s. Autopsy laws varied by state and country, but most granted broad discretion to medical examiners and pathologists. The legal framework that would later establish requirements for informed consent and next of kin notification did not yet exist. But legality and ethics are not synonymous, and what was happening under Project Sunshine violated a fundamental principle of human dignity, that people have a right to know what happens to their bodies and to the bodies of their loved ones. The collection process varied by location. In some hospitals, dedicated pathologists handled the sampling. In others, the work was distributed among rotating staff. Some institutions maintained detailed records of which bodies had been sampled. Others kept minimal documentation. Samples were assigned identification numbers that corresponded to basic demographic data: age, sex, date of death, and location. But names were removed to protect privacy. This had the effect of transforming individual human beings into anonymous data points. A 6-month-old infant from Chicago became sample 312. A 3-year-old from London became sample 498. The dehumanization was procedural, not malicious, but the effect was the same, and it was widespread. Samples were collected from New York, Chicago, London, Melbourne, Johannesburg, and dozens of other cities. The project sought geographic diversity to compare fallout levels across regions: urban and rural populations, coastal and inland, northern and southern hemispheres. The world, in effect, became a laboratory, and the subjects had no idea they were part of the experiment. By 1955, Project Sunshine had collected samples from more than 1,500 bodies. By 1957, that number had grown to over 5,000. The scale was staggering. The secrecy was absolute. Chapter 5: A Global Network. By the mid-1950s, Project Sunshine had evolved into one of the most extensive tissue sampling operations in medical history. Researchers coordinated across continents. Samples were catalogued by age, sex, location, and date of death. Strontium-90 levels were measured with increasing precision. Patterns began to emerge. Children showed higher concentrations than adults. Populations near testing sites showed elevated readings. Fallout levels varied by season and weather patterns. The international dimension of the project revealed disparities that were both scientifically significant and politically uncomfortable. Samples from Australia, for instance, showed elevated strontium levels, corresponding to British nuclear tests conducted at Maralinga and Emu Field. Samples from regions downwind of the Nevada test site showed similar elevations. The data was startling. It confirmed what scientists had feared. Radioactive material was not staying in the stratosphere. It was coming down. It was entering the food supply, and it was accumulating in human tissue. This was not theoretical contamination. This was measurable, quantifiable, real. The findings were shared in classified reports. They informed policy decisions about testing frequency, atmospheric conditions, and public messaging. Atmospheric. Testing protocols were quietly adjusted. Certain test series were delayed or relocated. Meteorological data was incorporated into test planning to minimize fallout over populated areas. But the public was never told why, because to explain the adjustments would require explaining the data, and to explain the data would require explaining how it was obtained. The coordination required for Project Sunshine was remarkable in its scope. Tissue samples had to be preserved properly during collection, packaged for international shipping, and delivered to analysis facilities without degradation. Specialized laboratories capable of measuring trace levels of radioactive isotopes had to be identified and secured. Results had to be compiled, cross-referenced, and interpreted. All of this required extensive bureaucratic infrastructure: purchase orders, shipping manifests, laboratory reports, personnel clearances, and all of it had to remain secret. The paper trail existed, but it was buried in classified files dispersed across multiple agencies and institutions. Individual researchers often knew only their specific role in the larger operation. Pathologists collecting samples might not know where the tissue was being sent or what would be done with it. Laboratory technicians analysing samples might not know their origin. This compartmentalisation was deliberate. It minimised the risk of leaks and reduced the likelihood that any single individual would grasp the full scope of the operation. Project Sunshine remained classified, but the data it generated was beginning to have an impact. Chapter 6: What the data revealed. The results were published in obscure scientific journals under titles that gave no hint of their origin. Papers with names like strontium metabolism in human bone or radioisotope distribution in pediatric skeletal tissue appeared in radiological and biochemical publications. The language was dense, technical, deliberately inaccessible to lay readers, but the conclusions were clear. Strontium-90 was present in every sample tested. Children born after 1945 showed higher levels than those born before. Levels peaked in populations geographically closer to test sites or downwind from atmospheric detonations. The half-life of strontium-90 meant it would remain in bones for decades. This was evidence of a global contamination event, and it was happening in real time. The scientific implications were profound. Strontium-90, once absorbed into bone tissue, could irradiate surrounding cells for years. In children, whose bones were still growing and whose cells were dividing rapidly, this posed a particular risk. The potential for long-term health effects, including increased cancer rates and developmental abnormalities, was undeniable. The data also revealed something unexpected: the variability of exposure. Not all populations showed the same levels of contamination. Diet played a significant role. Communities that relied heavily on dairy products showed higher strontium levels because cows concentrated the isotope in their milk. Children who consumed more milk, which was recommended for healthy bone development, were paradoxically at higher risk. This created a cruel irony. The very dietary practices designed to promote child health were also serving as vectors for radioactive contamination. The findings influenced policy in quiet ways. The United States and the Soviet Union eventually moved toward underground testing. Atmospheric tests became less frequent. International agreements were drafted, though slowly. Scientists began advocating for reductions in testing, based on evidence they could not publicly disclose. By 1963, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed, prohibiting atmospheric, underwater and space-based nuclear tests. The treaty was hailed as a triumph of diplomacy and scientific rationality. It was presented as a mutual recognition of the dangers posed by continued atmospheric testing. What was not mentioned was the source of the evidence that made those dangers undeniable. Project Sunshine had provided the data that informed the treaty, but the cost of that evidence had been concealed. The scientific community celebrated the treaty as a victory. Atmospheric testing declined dramatically. Fallout levels began to decrease. Within a few years, strontium-90 levels in human tissue started to drop. The danger had been real. The response had been effective, but the methods used to gather the evidence remained hidden. Chapter 7: The Secrecy. For years, Project Sunshine existed in a state of deliberate obscurity. Scientists involved in the project were instructed not to discuss their work publicly. Research findings were shared within classified networks, but withheld from broader medical and scientific communities. Funding was funneled through agencies with innocuous names. Reports were written in language designed to obscure rather than illuminate. Even within the government, awareness of the project was limited. Congressional oversight was minimal. The public had no knowledge of it whatsoever. When questions did arise, they were deflected. Journalists who inquired about radiation research were given sanitized explanations. Government spokespeople emphasized ongoing efforts to monitor environmental contamination through soil and water sampling. They mentioned animal studies and atmospheric monitoring, but they never mentioned the human tissue collection program. Concerned citizens were reassured that all testing was safe and all research ethical. Letters to government agencies expressing worry about fallout received form responses emphasizing safety protocols and careful monitoring. The responses were technically truthful. Monitoring was indeed occurring. but they omitted the most disturbing details. Whistleblowers, if they existed, were silenced through classification restrictions and security clearances. Anyone with knowledge of the program had signed agreements prohibiting disclosure. Violation could result in prosecution under espionage laws. The threat was real and sufficient to ensure silence. The narrative was controlled, and the truth remained buried. The secrecy was maintained not just through legal mechanisms, but through institutional culture. Scientists working on classified programs understood that discretion was expected. Many had been involved in the Manhattan Project or other wartime research efforts. They were accustomed to working on projects whose full scope and purpose were known only to a select few. This culture of secrecy had served a purpose during the war, but it persisted long after, creating an environment where ethical oversight was minimal and public accountability non-existent. The compartmentalization that protected Project Sunshine from exposure also insulated it from scrutiny. Individual participants could rationalize their involvement by focusing on their limited role. Pathologists told themselves they were simply collecting samples as directed. Laboratory technicians focused on the technical aspects of their analysis. Administrators processed paperwork without questioning its purpose. No single person bore full responsibility, and therefore no one felt fully accountable. But secrets, especially ones involving thousands of families, do not stay hidden forever. The first hints of trouble came not from whistleblowers but from journalists investigating unrelated radiation experiments. In the 1970s, reporters began uncovering stories about prisoners and hospital patients who had been subjected to radiation exposure without informed consent. These revelations prompted broader inquiries into government-sponsored research programs. Freedom of Information Act requests began yielding documents. Most were heavily redacted. But patient researchers, combing through thousands of pages, began to piece together fragments of a larger picture. References to tissue collection programs appeared in budget documents. Shipping manifests mentioned bone samples. Laboratory reports referenced strontium analysis. Slowly, the outline of Project Sunshine began to emerge. Chapter 8. The Truth Emerges. The first cracks in the secrecy appeared in the early 1980s. Journalists began uncovering documents related to Cold War radiation experiments. Freedom of Information Act requests yielded heavily redacted files. Researchers digging through archived government records stumbled onto references to tissue collection programs. Slowly, the scope of Project Sunshine came into focus. The initial reports were fragmented and incomplete. Individual journalists working independently had discovered pieces of the story, but none had assembled the complete picture. A reporter in Boston uncovered records of bone sample shipments from local hospitals. A researcher in London found references to a coordinated tissue collection effort involving multiple countries. An investigative journalist in Washington obtained budget documents showing funding for a project with the codename Sunshine. As these fragments came together, the implications became impossible to ignore. In 1994, a presidential advisory committee was formed to investigate human radiation experiments conducted during the Cold War. Project Sunshine was among the programs examined. The committee was granted access to classified files and authorized to interview former participants. What they found was damning. Thousands of tissue samples had been collected without consent. Families had been kept in the dark. Children's remains had been used as data points in a global monitoring system. The scale and duration of the program exceeded anything previously disclosed. The committee's final report, published in 1995, ran to more than 900 pages. An entire chapter was devoted to Project Sunshine. The language was measured but unequivocal in its criticism. The report concluded that while the scientific objectives of the project were legitimate, the methods employed were ethically indefensible. The failure to obtain consent violated fundamental principles of research ethics. The deception practiced on grieving families compounded the violation, and the secrecy maintained for decades prevented accountability and undermined public trust. Public reaction was muted but deeply unsettled. The story made headlines for a few days. Television news programs ran segments featuring interviews with elderly parents who learned, decades after the fact, that their children's bodies had been part of a research program. Their reactions range from anger to resignation to profound grief. Many expressed a sense of betrayal. They had trusted institutions, hospitals, government agencies, the medical profession, and that trust had been violated. The revelation reopened old wounds and created new bonds. Apologies were issued. The president made a formal statement expressing regret for the program and acknowledging the pain it had caused. Some compensation was offered to families who could be identified and located, though many could not. The passage of time had scattered families, destroyed records, and left gaps that could never be filled. But accountability was limited. Most of the individuals involved in the project had retired or died. Institutional responsibility was diffuse. The Atomic Energy Commission had been dissolved and reorganized. The hospitals and morgues that participated were scattered across multiple countries and jurisdictions. Legal liability was difficult to establish. The government acknowledged ethical failures, but the damage had been done decades earlier. Families who learned their loved ones had been part of the project expressed anger, grief, and betrayal. Many felt violated. Some sought legal recourse, though few cases succeeded. The statute of limitations had long since expired. Proving harm was difficult, and the legal framework for addressing historical injustices was limited. Support groups formed, bringing together families affected by Project Sunshine and similar programs. They shared stories, sought answers, and advocated for reforms to prevent future abuses. Some found a measure of closure in the acknowledgement of what had happened. Others felt the apologies were inadequate and the accountability insufficient. The story made headlines briefly, then faded. But it left a mark. The revelations about Project Sunshine contributed to a broader reckoning with the ethics of Cold War research. They prompted reforms in how research involving human subjects is conducted and overseen. They strengthened requirements for informed consent and institutional review. They established precedents for transparency and accountability. But they also revealed something troubling about how institutions behave when operating in secrecy, because the scientists and officials involved in Project Sunshine were not monsters. They were ordinary people working within a system that prioritized results over ethics, security over transparency, and expediency over accountability. And that system still exists. Chapter 9. The Conspiracy Interpretation. For conspiracy theorists, Project Sunshine is not a cautionary tale about scientific overreach. It is proof. Proof that governments are willing to treat their own citizens as expendable. Proof that secrecy is used not to protect the public, but to protect the powerful. Proof that consent is optional when the stakes are high enough. The theory goes like this. Project Sunshine was not just a monitoring program. It was part of a broader strategy to understand the effects of radiation exposure in preparation for nuclear conflict. Governments needed to know how populations would fare in a post-nuclear world. They needed baseline data on radiation absorption, accumulation, and biological impact, and they were willing to collect it by any means necessary. The tissue samples were not taken to protect children from fallout. They were taken to measure the damage that had already been done. And more than that, some theorists argue the data was used to calibrate expectations for a nuclear war. If policymakers knew how much radiation the population could absorb before experiencing catastrophic health effects, they could factor that into strategic planning. The acceptable casualty rates in a nuclear exchange could be calculated with greater precision. In this interpretation, atmospheric testing was not a regrettable necessity of weapons development. It was a deliberate experiment on a global scale. Civilians were not bystanders, they were test subjects. The fallout was not an unfortunate byproduct, but a field trial of radioactive contamination effects on real populations. And Project Sunshine was the autopsy report. This version of the story reframes the entire Cold War nuclear program as a series of calculated risks taken with other people's lives. It casts scientists not as heroes seeking to understand and mitigate danger, but as collaborators in a vast and morally corrosive system that prioritize strategic advantage over human welfare. It is a dark interpretation, but it is not entirely without evidence. Declassified documents reveal that military planners did indeed use data about radiation exposure to model the effects of nuclear war. They calculated acceptable casualty rates. They estimated how much contamination populations could endure. They factored these projections into targeting decisions and civil defence planning. The question is whether Project Sunshine was intended to serve these purposes from the beginning, or whether its data was simply repurposed for strategic planning after the fact. The official narrative holds that the project was purely scientific, an effort to understand the environmental and health consequences of atmospheric testing. The data it generated subsequently informed policy decisions, including decisions about nuclear strategy, but that was a secondary application. The conspiracy interpretation argues that the strategic applications were always the primary objective. The scientific justification was a cover story. The real purpose was to gather data that would be useful in planning for and surviving a nuclear war. The truth, as often happens, likely falls somewhere in between. Project Sunshine was probably conceived with genuine scientific objectives, but once the data existed, it was inevitable that it would be used for strategic purposes. And the people making decisions about the program were certainly aware of those potential applications. Whether that constitutes a conspiracy depends on how you define the term. If a conspiracy requires deliberate intent to deceive for malicious purposes, then Project Sunshine may not qualify. The deception was real, but the purpose was framed by those involved as protective rather than malicious. If a conspiracy simply requires secret coordination to achieve outcomes that would be unacceptable if publicly known, then Project Sunshine fits the definition perfectly. The semantic debate matters less than the underlying reality. A government program collected tissue from thousands of dead children without permission, kept the practice secret for decades, and used the resulting data to inform decisions about nuclear weapons and warfare. That is not theory. That is documented fact. Chapter 10. The Ethical Line. At the heart of Project Sunshine is a question that extends far beyond radiation or the Cold War. How far can a government go in the name of protecting its people? Is deception acceptable if it prevents panic? Is consent optional if the stakes are existential? Can the ends ever truly justify the means? Project Sunshine operated on the assumption that they could. The scientists involved believed they were doing necessary work. They were gathering data that could inform policy, save lives, and prevent catastrophic misjudgments about radiation exposure. In their view, the public good outweighed individual rights. The information they gathered contributed to decisions that eventually reduced atmospheric testing and lowered radiation exposure for millions of people. From a utilitarian perspective, the calculus might seem defensible. If the data from Project Sunshine helped end atmospheric testing, and if ending atmospheric testing prevented countless cases of cancer and genetic damage, then the violation of a few thousand families' rights might appear justified. But that calculus was made without asking the people most affected. The families who buried children never knew those children contributed to a global research project. The parents who grieved had no idea their loss was also a data point, and that absence of consent fundamentally undermines any utilitarian justification, because utilitarian ethics, properly applied, requires considering the interests and autonomy of all affected parties. By excluding families from the decision-making process, Project Sunshine violated the very principle it claimed to uphold, the greatest good for the greatest number. The families affected were not a small minority whose interests could be justifiably overridden for the greater good. They were thousands of people whose fundamental rights were violated, and their violation was not necessary for the research to succeed. An alternative approach was possible. Tissue collection programs based on informed consent have existed for decades. Many families, when asked, willingly donate tissue from deceased loved ones for medical research. Some might have declined, certainly, but many would have agreed if the purpose and importance of the research had been explained. The decision to proceed without consent was not based on impossibility. It was based on convenience and fear that asking for consent would raise uncomfortable questions, fear that transparency would undermine public support for nuclear testing, fear that honesty would expose the extent of radiation contamination. These fears may have been justified, but they do not justify the deception. The ethical line was crossed not in a moment of crisis, but in a series of quiet decisions made behind closed doors. Each decision seemed small, each could be rationalised, each moved the line a little further, and that perhaps is the most unsettling part, because it suggests the line is not fixed, it can be moved, and once it is moved, it becomes easier to move again. The history of human subjects research is littered with examples of this pattern. The Tuskegee syphilis study, the plutonium injection experiments, the involuntary sterilisation programs. Each began with a rationale that seemed compelling to those involved. Each involved vulnerable populations. Each was conducted in secrecy or with inadequate oversight, and each violated fundamental ethical principles. Project Sunshine fits this pattern. It is not unique, it is emblematic, and the systems that enabled it have not been entirely dismantled. Modern research ethics regulations are stronger than they were in the 1950s. Institutional review boards provide oversight. Informed consent requirements are rigorously enforced. Transparency is expected, but exceptions still exist. Research conducted for national security purposes can be exempted from normal oversight. Emergency circumstances can justify deviations from consent requirements, and secrecy, when deemed necessary, can shield questionable practices from public scrutiny. The architecture that enabled Project Sunshine remains in place. It is better regulated, more constrained, subject to more oversight, but it exists, and that should concern us. Epilogue: The Invisible Legacy. Atmospheric nuclear testing ended decades ago. The mushroom clouds are gone, the fallout has settled, but the legacy remains. Strontium-90 is still present in the environment. It has a half-life of nearly 29 years, meaning traces of it persist in soil, water, and bones to this day. Every person alive who was born before the Test Ban Treaty carries some level of radioactive material in their body. The levels are low now, declining with each year that passes, but they are measurable. Project Sunshine is officially over. The files are declassified. The samples, for the most part, have been destroyed or returned. But the questions it raised have not been answered. What is the cost of knowledge? Who gets to decide what is acceptable in the name of science? And when does protection become exploitation? These are not historical questions. They are present ones. The COVID pandemic revealed similar tensions. Public health officials faced difficult decisions about lockdowns, vaccine mandates, and contact tracing. They balanced individual liberty against collective safety. They weighed transparency against preventing panic. They made choices that affected millions of lives based on incomplete information and urgent timelines. Some of those decisions were made with broad public input and democratic accountability. Others were made behind closed doors by experts and officials operating under emergency authorities. The fundamental dynamic that enabled Project Sunshine, governments making decisions for people without their knowledge, still exists. It exists in surveillance programs, in data collection, in public health policy, in emergency response. The tools have changed, the justifications have evolved, but the pattern remains. Modern technology has made surveillance and data collection easier and more pervasive than ever before. Governments and corporations gather vast amounts of information about individuals, often without explicit consent or awareness. The data is used for purposes ranging from targeted advertising to national security. The justifications are similar to those offered for Project Sunshine: efficiency, protection, the greater good. And the secrecy is often similar as well. People do not know what data is being collected about them. They do not know how it is being used. They do not know who has access to it or what decisions are being made based on it. The informed consent that is now required for medical research does not necessarily apply to data collection in other contexts, and that is the real conspiracy. Not that Project Sunshine happened, but that the conditions that made it possible still exist. The specific practices have changed. We are not collecting bone samples from dead children anymore, but we are collecting vast amounts of data from living people. We are making decisions that affect their lives, their health, and their freedom, and we are often doing so without their knowledge or meaningful consent. The justifications are always compelling. national security, public health, economic, efficiency, crime prevention, and the oversight is always inadequate, because the people making the decisions are not the people affected by them, and the people affected often do not know the decisions are being made. That was true in the 1950s, it is still true today. Project Sunshine stands as a reminder of what can happen when institutional power operates without accountability, when secrecy replaces transparency, when the ends are allowed to justify the means without asking whether the means themselves violate the principles the ends are meant to protect. The scientists involved in Project Sunshine were not evil. They were people doing what they believed was necessary work under extraordinary circumstances. Many probably struggled with the ethical dimensions of what they were doing. Some may have protested internally, even if they complied outwardly. But the system they were part of did not require them to be evil. It only required them to be compliant, to follow procedures, to trust that someone above them had made the right decision, to focus on their specific task without questioning the larger purpose. That is how institutional wrongdoing happens, not through individual malice, but through collective compliance. And that is why the legacy of Project Sunshine matters, because the most dangerous experiments are the ones people never knew they were part of, until it is far too late. The bones collected in the 1950s are gone now, returned to families when possible, destroyed or lost in many cases. The radioactive isotopes they contained have decayed. The scientific questions they were meant to answer have been answered, but the ethical questions remain. And they are questions we will have to answer again, in different contexts, with different technologies, for different reasons. But the fundamental dilemma is the same. How much can we trust institutions